They mocked my crumpled ticket while pocketing $180 million, unaware they had stepped into a lethal trap. 36 hours later, a single whisper on the Riviera transformed me into the chairman of a $2.4 billion empire. Do not look away. This shocking reversal begins now. The sky over Greenwich, Connecticut, was the color of a bruised lung. A relentless, cold drizzle soaked the manicured lawns of the Sterling estate, turning the sprawling acres into a landscape of muted grays and deep, suffocating greens. Inside the great hall, the atmosphere was even heavier. The air was a thick blend of expensive upholstery, the acrid bite of high-end tobacco, and the floral, almost medicinal scent of thousands of white lilies. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows feeling like a single drop of oil in a vat of distilled water. We occupied the same space, but we would never mix. My suit was an off-the-rack navy wool from a department store sale 3 years ago, its fabric thin and lacking the structural integrity of the garments surrounding me. My hands, tucked awkwardly into my pockets, bore the faint yellowish stain of a potassium permanganate spill from yesterday's afternoon lab. A small purple bruise circled my left wrist where I had bumped against a lab table while trying to catch a falling beaker. My cousin, Hunter Harrison Sterling, patrolled the room like a predator who had already secured the kill. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that I knew cost $20,000. I knew the price because he had mentioned it 3 times to 3 different guests within the first hour. His hair was slicked back with a precision that defied the humidity of the rain, every strand reflecting the cold light of the crystal chandeliers above. "It is a tragedy, is it not?" Hunter said, though his eyes were dancing with a manic electric energy. He approached me with a crystal tumbler of deep amber liquid in his hand. "The patriarch has fallen. The throne is empty." Before I could respond, his sister, Sloane Avery Sterling, glided toward us. She was a vision of curated sorrow. Her black designer dress was so tight it looked like a second skin, and she clutched a limited edition Hermes Birkin bag as if it were a holy relic. She was not looking at the mahogany casket in the corner. She was looking at the screen of her titanium-framed phone, her thumb moving in a rapid rhythmic blur as she checked the engagement on her latest post. "The lighting in here is abysmal for the live stream," Sloane whispered, her voice a sharp, biting staccato. "Grandfather would have wanted me to look my best for the followers. It is about the brand, Caleb. You would not understand. You deal with... What is it, element speakers?" "I teach chemistry, Sloane," I said quietly. My voice felt small against the backdrop of the crackling fireplace and the low, rehearsed murmurs of New York's elite. Hunter laughed, a loud, jarring sound that lacked any genuine warmth. He stepped closer, his presence an intentional invasion of my personal space. I could smell the expensive gin on his breath and the overwhelming musk of his cologne. It was the scent of a man who believed the world was an equation he had already solved. "Chemistry?" Hunter mocked, tilting his glass. "Baking soda volcanoes and staining your fingers? It is adorable, really. While you were playing with test tubes, I was helping Grandfather leverage 3 commercial blocks in Midtown. There is a hierarchy to this world, Caleb. Some of us are the architects, and some of us are just the janitors." He shifted his weight with a calculated clumsiness. His elbow caught the side of my arm, and the amber liquid in his glass sloshed over the rim. It cascaded down my leg, soaking into the cheap fabric of my trousers and pooling onto my scuffed leather shoes. "Oh, blast," Hunter said, his voice dripping with feigned concern and a sharp, cruel irony. He did not move to help. He simply watched the stain spread. "I'm terribly sorry, Caleb, truly, but do not worry about the mess. I am sure those shoes were not expensive. In fact, that spill probably cost more than your monthly mortgage. Actually, do not fret. I am certain that 1 year of your teaching salary would barely cover the cost of the polish on my shoes. Just stay out of the way when the lawyers arrive. We do not want you smelling like a distillery when the real business begins." He turned his back on me, his laughter blending with the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. I stood there, the cold liquid seeping through my socks, feeling the weight of the Sterling name like a lead shroud. I looked at the bruise on my wrist and the stain on my shoes, the marks of a life they considered a failure. They did not realize that a chemical reaction was already beginning. They saw the humble teacher, but they failed to see the one thing Grandfather Arthur had always told me. The most dangerous elements are the ones that remain stable until the very last second. The clock on the mantel struck 2. The heavy oak doors of the study creaked open. It was time for the reading of the will. The atmosphere in the study was suffocating thick with the scent of old leather stagnant air and the palpable greed of those gathered around the massive mahogany desk. Mr. Thorne, the estate attorney, sat with a posture so rigid it seemed he was part of the furniture. He adjusted his silver-rimmed spectacles, cleared his throat, and laid out the heavy vellum documents that represented the shattered remains of the Sterling Empire. "We shall begin with the primary distributions, Mr." Thorne announced, his voice sounding like dry parchment rubbing together. I sat at the very edge of the group, my damp trousers sticking to my skin. Hunter leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes fixed on the documents like a hawk watching a field mouse. Sloane was busy checking her reflection in the darkened screen of her phone, though her ears were clearly tuned to every syllable. "To my grandson, Hunter Harrison Sterling," Thorne began, "I bequeath the entirety of my real estate holdings in Manhattan. This includes the Sterling Plaza on Fifth Avenue and the 12 commercial towers located within the Midtown District. The current estimated market valuation stands at $180 million. Hunter did not just smile. He exhaled a long, shaky breath of triumph. He looked as though he had just conquered a small nation. He reached out to adjust his cufflinks, the gold catching the dim light of the study, and shot a glance at me that was filled with nothing but cold, unadulterated pity. "To my granddaughter, Sloane Avery Sterling," the attorney continued, "I leave my private island Little Torch Key located in the Florida Keys, along with the complete fleet of Sterling yachts, including the sovereign vessel the Gilded Crest. Furthermore, she shall receive the liquid assets totaling $20 million for the maintenance of said properties." Sloane let out a sharp, jagged squeal of delight. She was already typing, her thumbs flying across her screen as she likely drafted a post for her millions of followers. To her, the death of our grandfather was not a tragedy. It was a rebranding opportunity. My mother, Martha, received the promised $250,000, a sum that would pay off the mortgage on her small house, but would never buy her a seat at the Sterling table. She squeezed my hand, her grip warm and steady, reminding me that we had never belonged in this room of predators. Finally, Mr. Thorne reached into a small wooden box and pulled out a single white envelope. It was a jarring contrast to the thick legal folders. The envelope was crumpled, as if it had been carried in a pocket for weeks, and a jagged brown coffee stain marred the bottom corner. My name was scrawled across the front in the hurried, sharp handwriting of Arthur Sterling. "And to my grandson, Caleb Thomas Vance," Thorne said, his voice dipping into a tone of confused hesitation, "I leave this." He slid the envelope across the desk. I picked it up with trembling fingers. Inside was not a deed, nor a check, nor a stock certificate. It was a single plane ticket, a one-way first-class ticket from New York to Nice, departing the following morning. Hunter peered over the desk, catching sight of the ticket, and he exploded into a fit of jagged, condescending laughter that echoed off the high ceilings. "A plane ticket," Hunter mocked, clutching his stomach as if he had just heard the world's greatest joke. "Are you serious? Grandfather literally left you a vacation. He wanted you to travel so you could finally see how the other half lives before you crawl back to your dusty chalkboard and your little beakers. It is a mercy gift, Caleb. He gave you a way to run away from your own poverty." Sloane giggled behind her manicured hand. "At least it is first class. Grandfather always did have a sense of irony. He wanted you to taste the champagne once before you spend the rest of your life drinking tap water." The room became a blur of their mockery, a cacophony of elitist scorn. I felt the heat rising in my neck, the familiar sting of being the family afterthought. But then I looked up. Above the fireplace hung the grand oil portrait of Arthur Sterling. His eyes were painted with a cold, steel-gray pigment, but as I stared at them they seemed to hold a secret intensity. I looked back down at the ticket. I examined the fine print, searching for a reason, a logic. That was when I saw it. The purchase date was October 14th. My heart skipped a beat. October 14th was not a random day. It was the exact day I had stood on a stage in a crowded gymnasium in Oakland to accept the Teacher of the Year award. I had told no one in the Sterling family about it. I knew they would only find a way to diminish the achievement to turn my passion into a punchline. I had kept that victory entirely to myself, and yet here was the proof that Arthur Sterling had known. He had bought this ticket on the very day of my greatest professional triumph, long before his health had taken its final turn. This was not a random gift of pity. It was a calculated response. It was a timed reaction. Hunter and Sloan were still laughing, their voices filled with the arrogance of those who believe they have already won. They saw a crumpled envelope and a single ticket. They saw a teacher who had been cast aside. They did not realize that while they were busy counting their millions, I was holding the key to a door they did not even know existed. I tucked the ticket into my pocket and stood up. I did not say a word. I did not need to. For the first time in my life, I was not the one being left behind. I was the one who was leaving. The light in Nice was a sharp crystalline blue that made my eyes ache. It was a world away from the suffocating grays and heavy rains of Greenwich. As I stepped onto the tarmac, the warm Mediterranean breeze carried the scent of salt and lavender, a fragrance that felt far too expensive for a man with $42 in his wallet. For a moment, I stood paralyzed. I felt like a fraud. I was a chemistry teacher from Oakland with stained fingers and a suit that smelled of the bargain rack. I almost turned back to the gate to ask about the next flight home. I thought of my students, the stacks of ungraded papers waiting on my desk, and the sheer absurdity of this journey. I was a man of logic of cause and effect, and there was no logical reason for me to be here. But then I remembered the voice of my mother Martha at the terminal in New York. She had gripped my shoulders, her eyes fierce and wet with unshed tears. "Caleb," she had whispered, "your grandfather was a man who never wasted a single penny or a single second. He did not send you across an ocean for a vacation. He sent you because you are the only one he could trust with the truth. Do not come home until you find it." I took a deep breath and walked through the terminal. At the arrivals exit, the crowd was a blur of sun-drenched tourists and frantic business travelers. Standing perfectly still amidst the chaos was a man who looked like he had been carved from marble. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit and held a simple, elegant sign that read Caleb Thomas Vance. "Mr. Vance?" the man asked as I approached. His voice was smooth, possessing the refined cadence of a diplomat. "Yes," I replied, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. "But I think there might be a mistake. I am just here because of a ticket my grandfather left me." The man smiled, but it was a gesture of respect, not mockery. He took my small carry-on bag with a slight bow. "There is no mistake, sir. I am Julian Vale. I have been expecting you for a very long time." He led me to a black Maybach idling at the curb. The paint was so polished it reflected the entire French coastline like a dark mirror. As he opened the rear door, I hesitated. This was the world of Hunter and Sloan, a world of excess that I had spent my entire adult life avoiding. "Please sit," Julian urged softly. I slid onto the heated leather seat. The interior smelled of expensive cedar and silence. Julian climbed in beside me and closed the door, sealing out the noise of the world. The car pulled away from the curb with a ghostly silence. Julian turned to me, his expression grave and expectant. Then he leaned in and spoke 7 words that shattered every reality I had ever known. "Welcome, Mr. Chairman. The world is waiting." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Chairman Julian, you have the wrong man. My cousin Hunter is the one who inherited the Sterling Empire. He got the buildings in Manhattan. He is the one with the $180 million. I am just a teacher." Julian pulled a sleek glass tablet from a hidden compartment and tapped the screen. A series of complex financial charts and red-lined ledgers appeared. "What your cousin inherited, Mr. Vance, is a gilded cage. The Sterling Group that Hunter is so proud of is a hollow shell. It is a labyrinth of dead-aging infrastructure and pending litigation that has been suppressed for decades. It looks like a mountain of gold, but it is actually a mountain of glass ready to shatter. I watched the red lines on the screen. The numbers were staggering. You are saying my grandfather left him nothing? Worse than nothing, Julian replied. He left him a distraction. While Hunter and Sloan were busy fighting over the visible scraps, Arthur Sterling was quietly dismantling the empire from within. For 20 years, he moved every profitable asset, every patent, and every liquid reserve out of the family business and into a private offshore entity. He swiped the screen and a new set of numbers appeared in brilliant, steady green. "This is the Sterling Global Fund," Julian whispered. "It is a private, philanthropic, and investment powerhouse with a current liquidity of $2.4 billion. It owns the future, renewable energy, clean water technology, and medical research. And because of the way the trust is structured, it has no board of directors and no shareholders to satisfy." I gasped, my mind spinning. "Who controls it?" Julian handed me the tablet. At the bottom of the screen was a signature line that required a biometric thumbprint and a specific digital key. "You do, Caleb. Arthur was a master of the chemistry, much like you. He knew that the most valuable elements are often hidden deep within the earth, protected by layers of common rock. He knew Hunter and Sloan would never look past the gold. You are the only one who can sign the release for these funds. You are the only one who can decide the fate of the Sterling legacy. Hunter got the name, but you got the power." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The crumpled envelope, the first-class ticket, the timing. Grandfather had not sent me away to humiliate me. He had evacuated me before the explosion. "They cannot know." Julian warned, his eyes narrowing as the car climbed the winding hills of the coast. "The moment they realize the inheritance they bragged about is a debt trap, they will come for this fund like starving wolves. You must remain the humble teacher until the trap is fully sprung. Can you do that, Caleb?" I looked at the tablet, then at my stained fingers. $2.4 billion. It was an amount of money that did not even feel real, but the responsibility did. "What do we do now?" I asked. Julian tapped the glass partition, signaling the driver to increase their speed. "Now, Mr. Chairman, we go to the villa. There's a lab waiting for you, and a journal that explains why he chose you to save us all." The villa was an architectural marvel of white limestone and glass clinging to the jagged cliffs of the Quai d'Azur like a stubborn pearl. As Julian Vale led me through the arched mahogany entrance, the scent of the sea was replaced by the smell of old paper and beeswax. We did not go to a grand ballroom or a dining hall. Instead, Julian stopped before a pair of heavy, unmarked doors at the end of a long, sun-drenched corridor. "This," Julian said, his voice dropping to a respectful whisper, "is what your grandfather called his Hall of Redemption." He pushed the doors open. I expected to see a collection of rare art or gold bullion. Instead, I found myself standing in a gallery of my own life. The walls were covered with hundreds of photographs neatly framed in simple black wood. There were photos of me at 7 years old building a birdhouse with my father in the backyard. Photos of me at my college graduation looking tired but proud. There were even photos of me last month standing at the chalkboard in Oakland, my shirt sleeves rolled up passionately explaining the periodic table to a class of distracted teenagers. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He had me followed. All those years he ignored my calls, he was watching me. He was not just watching you, Caleb, Julian corrected, walking toward a large digital screen at the center of the room. He was studying you. Arthur Sterling spent 50 years surrounding himself with sycophants, sharks, and liars. He realized too late that he had raised children and grandchildren who were clones of his worst traits. He told me once that he needed to find one person in his bloodline who had not been poisoned by the Sterling name. He wanted to learn if it was still possible to be a good man. Julian tapped the screen. A video began to play. The date on the corner was from 2 years ago. I recognized the setting immediately. It was my small, cluttered office at the high school. A man in an expensive suit was sitting across from me, sliding a thick white envelope across the desk. I remembered that man. He was a wealthy developer whose son was failing my class, a failure that would cost him his spot at an Ivy League university. In the video, I did not even open the envelope. I simply pushed it back with the tip of my pen. I heard my own voice, steady and calm. Your son's grade is a reflection of his effort, not your bank account. If he wants an A, he needs to understand the material, not just the price of my integrity. Please leave. The video froze on my face. Beneath the screen, a brass plaque was engraved with Arthur's sharp handwriting. This is the person who will keep the Sterling family from rotting. Integrity is the only currency that does not devalue. I sat down on a leather bench, my head spinning. He had tested me. Every struggle, every moment I felt forgotten was part of a long, silent observation. But there is more, Julian said, his tone turning clinical and cold. He pulled up a map of the Manhattan properties Hunter had inherited and the Florida island given to Sloan. You asked why he gave them the visible empire. It was not a gift, Caleb. It was a poison pill. Julian began to display legal documents that were marked with the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. Arthur knew the Sterling Group was built on sand. 20 years ago, to fund his early expansions, he engaged in a series of highly illegal tax shelters and international money laundering schemes. He knew the authorities were closing in. If he had died with those assets in his name, the entire family would have been dragged into the abyss. I stared at the screen. He gave those properties to Hunter and Sloan to protect himself. No, Julian said with a grim smile. He gave them those properties because he knew they were too greedy to look at the books. By accepting the inheritance, Hunter and Sloan have legally assumed the roles of executive officers for those specific shell companies. They signed the papers in that study back in Greenwich. The moment they attempt to sell those buildings to pay off the mounting debts, they will trigger a federal audit that will land them in prison for decades. If they keep the properties, the interest on the hidden debts will bankrupt them within a year. The sheer brilliance of the trap was terrifying. Arthur had given them exactly what they wanted, and in doing so he had handed them their own destruction. Only you can save them. Julian continued, his eyes locking onto mine. The Sterling Global Fund is entirely clean. It is a separate entity. You have the capital to pay off the debts and settle with the government. But Arthur's will contain a very specific ironclad condition for any such bailout. What is the condition? I asked. To receive a single dollar of your protection, Hunter and Sloan must legally forfeit the Sterling name. They must sign a permanent waiver of all future claims to any family wealth and agree to live on a modest teacher's equivalent allowance monitored by the fund. They must become the very thing they mocked you for being. I looked back at the photo of myself in the classroom. I was the one they had called a failure. I was the one they had laughed at. Now, I held their freedom in my hands. The reaction was complete. The elements had shifted, and the power had changed states. What is our next move, Mr. Chairman? Julian asked. I stood up the weight of the $2 billion, finally feeling less like a burden and more like a tool. We let them feel the heat first, I said. Let them realize their gold is made of lead. Then we see if they are capable of learning the lesson I teach every day, that everything has a price. The iron gates of the Sterling estate in Greenwich were no longer guarded by private security in polished uniforms. Instead, 2 black SUVs with government plates sat idling in the gravel driveway. The air that had once smelled of expensive lilies and arrogance was now thick with the sterile scent of panic. I walked through the front doors without knocking. The great hall was a disaster zone. Cardboard boxes filled with files lined the marble floors, and men in windbreakers with IRS and FBI stenciled on the back were methodically tagging the furniture. I found Hunter and Sloan in the study, the same room where they had laughed at my crumpled envelope 10 days ago. The transformation was staggering. Hunter's $20,000 suit was wrinkled, his silk tie loosened and stained with sweat. His hair, once perfectly slicked back, was a chaotic mess. Sloane was huddled on the antique sofa, her face puffy from crying, her limited edition Birkin bag discarded on the floor like a piece of trash. "Caleb," Hunter shouted the moment he saw me. He lunged forward, grabbing my shoulders with a desperate, crushing grip. "You have to help us. You were in Monaco, right? Did you find anything, a secret, account, a hidden safe, anything?" I gently removed his hands from my coat. I remained as still as a lake in winter. "What happened to the $180 million, Hunter? What happened to the empire?" "It was a setup," Sloane wailed, her voice cracking. "The Manhattan Towers are hemorrhaging money. There are environmental lawsuits from the 90s that grandfather buried, and the IRS says the ownership structures are fraudulent. They have frozen everything, every account, every credit card. We cannot even pay the staff. They are going to take the house, Caleb. They are going to take everything." Hunter paced the room like a caged animal. "We need a bridge loan, just $50 million. I know grandfather liked you. He must have given you some contact, some name in Europe. If we do not settle with the feds by Monday, they are going to file criminal charges. They are talking about money laundering, Caleb. Prison time." I looked at them, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel the sting of their insults or the weight of my own modesty. I felt only a profound clinical clarity. I saw two people who had built their entire identities on a foundation of stolen sand, and now the tide had come in. "I cannot give you a loan, Hunter," I said. My voice was low and steady, the tone I used when a student was caught cheating on a final exam. "Why not?" Hunter screamed, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. "You were his grandson, too. Did he leave you something over there or not? Just tell us." I took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch between us, until the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock. "I do not have $180 million like you, Hunter. I do not have private islands or yachts. I only have a charitable organization." Hunter blinked, his mouth hanging open. A charity? What are you talking about?" "The Sterling Global Fund," I replied. "It is a non-profit entity dedicated to global infrastructure and education. It is completely insulated from the Sterling Group. It is clean, and it is very, very large." Sloane sat up, her eyes wide with a sudden predatory hope. "Then use it, pay off the IRS. Buy the towers from the government. You can save us, Caleb. We are family." I looked at Sloane, then back at Hunter. I thought of the janitor comment. I thought of the gin spilled on my shoes. I thought of the thousands of employees in those Manhattan Towers who were currently wondering if they would have a paycheck on Friday to feed their families. "I have already signed the paperwork with Julian Valevale," I said. "The Sterling Global Fund has officially acquired the pension liabilities and the back pay obligations for every single janitor, secretary, and maintenance worker in the Sterling Group. Their families are safe. Their health care is secured. I will not let the people who actually built this empire suffer for your greed." Hunter's face lit up with a grotesque smile. "Great. That is great. Now, what about the criminal charges? What about the settlement for me and Sloane?" I looked him directly in the eyes. "That is where my involvement ends. The fund is for charity, Hunter. It is for those who are innocent. You and Sloane were executive officers for those shell companies. You signed the documents because you were too busy looking at the profit margins to care about the legality. You chose to be architects of this corruption. You are leaving us to rot," Sloane shrieked, standing up. "You're going to let them take us to jail." "I am letting the law do its job," I said. "I am a teacher, Sloane. I believe in consequences. You spent your life treating the world like a joke where the rules did not apply to you. Now you have reached the end of the chapter." I turned to leave. Behind me, Hunter began to scream obscenities and Sloane collapsed back into the sofa, her cries echoing through the hollowed-out shell of the estate. As I walked out past the FBI agents, I felt no joy in their downfall. I only felt the quiet, steady hum of a reaction finally reaching equilibrium. I walked to my car, the same old sedan I had driven for years. I had $2.4 billion at my command, but as I pulled out of the driveway, I was already thinking about my lesson plan for Monday morning. The Sterling name was dying, but the Sterling legacy was finally beginning. Monday morning in Oakland felt different yet exactly the same. The sun filtered through the high-barred windows of the chemistry lab, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I could hear the familiar chaotic rumble of students in the hallway, the slamming of lockers, and the rhythmic beat of sneakers against the linoleum. I stood at the front of the room, smoothing out the periodic table chart that was slightly peeling at the edges. 10 days ago, I was a man mourning a grandfather I barely knew. 2 days ago, I was a billionaire chairman in a French villa holding the fate of a global empire in my hands. Today, I was just Caleb Thomas Vance, the man responsible for Period 4 chemistry. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the only inheritance that had not come from a bank account or a legal deed. It was Arthur Sterling's vintage gold pocket watch. It was scratched, the hinge was slightly loose, and it was worth perhaps a few $100s at an antique shop. But to me, it was the most valuable object in existence. It was a symbol of a man who had finally found someone he could trust with the truth. I set it on the corner of my desk. It ticked with a steady, reassuring pulse, a reminder that time is the only thing we can never buy back. My students filed in oblivious to the fact that their teacher had spent the weekend dismantling a corrupt dynasty and securing their futures through a secret global fund. Maria sat in the front row, her brow furrowed as she looked at her textbook. She did not know that a full scholarship from the Sterling Global Fund would be waiting for her at the end of the year. James and Destiny were arguing about a lab report, unaware that the state-of-the-art equipment arriving next month was not a gift from the school district, but a silent investment from a man who believed in their potential. I picked up a piece of white chalk. My fingers were steady. The stains from the previous week's experiments were gone, replaced by the invisible weight of a massive legacy. I looked at the chalkboard and then at the faces of 30 teenagers who were waiting for me to speak. I felt a sense of peace that no amount of money could ever purchase. I wrote a single word in large, bold letters across the center of the board, Catalyst. I turned to the class, meeting their eyes one by one. In chemistry, I began, my voice clear and resonant. A catalyst is a substance that increases the rate of a chemical reaction without undergoing any permanent chemical change itself. It is a source of power that changes everything it touches, yet remains true to its own nature. I thought of the billions sitting in the Monaco accounts currently being deployed to build schools in Africa and hospitals in South America. I thought of Hunter and Sloan, who were currently drowning in the consequences of their own choices because they had viewed money as the destination. I viewed it as the reagent. Money is a catalyst, I said, more to myself than to them. It is not a solution, and it is not a goal, it is simply an accelerator. Depending on whose hands it is, and it can create a violent, destructive explosion that leaves nothing but ash and regret. Or it can be used to transform the common, the overlooked, and the ordinary into pure gold. It can turn a struggling classroom into a cradle for the next generation of leaders. I choose the transformation. Now please open your textbooks to page 142. We have work to do. As the students began to read, I looked down at the pocket watch. The second hand swept forward, constant and unwavering. The Sterling name was gone, but the work was just beginning. What's your take on Caleb's hidden legacy? Your insights help me improve and bring you higher quality stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, and follow for more impactful content that challenges the way you see the world. Thank you for being part of this community. More stories are coming soon.